The story of how the theory of evolution emerged begins with Darwin. Not Charles Darwin, rather his grandfather Erasmus Darwin. Although these two famous Darwins were not living during the same time, Erasmus greatly influenced Charles in his quest to understand the natural world. Erasmus was the first naturalist to publish a detailed theory of evolution in a 2-volume collection titled Zoonomia, or the Laws of Organic Life. Had Charles made different choices, he may not have ended up on the HMS Beagle and we would be talking about Alfred Wallace instead. That is, if Wallace also had the connections with the Royal Science Society. His father, Dr. Robert Darwin, thought his son was a freeloader on the wealth accumulated by himself and Erasmus's medical practice and investments. Over the course of his education, Charles was being groomed to enter the medical field and take over the family practice. Charles maintained his curiosity in living things and grew his collections. At the resolve of his father, Charles changed his career pathway to become a clergyman so he could keep an excuse to traipse across the countryside and world. However, it would take a great deal of convincing to embark on an unreliable British Navy vessel named the HMS Beagle, and so he ended up aboard, leaving December 27, 1831, and returning October 2, 1836. Charles Darwin was hardly one of the first people to try to explain the diversity of living things, let alone what kind of changes occurred over geologic time. We can look at the work of Plato, Aristotle, David Hume, James Hutton, George Louis Buffon, and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, for example. So why do we still talk about Charles Darwin? Because during his time aboard the HMS Beagle as the ship's naturalist and companion to Captain Robert Fitzroy, he collected a lot of fossils and specimens that showed great degrees of variation. He lacked a mechanism, though, which could explain the variation in his collections. It was when he arrived in the Galapagos archipelago in September 1835 that he concluded that changes had occurred through descent with modification, or natural selection. Environmental and selective pressures favored certain adaptations over others, leading to changes within a population. Let's look at this mechanism through understanding the many species of giant Galapagos tortoises. One of the most important ingredients for evolution to occur is variation. Variation is a distinct or different form or version of something. In this case, variation exists in traits and genes of organisms. As we already know, our genes are composed of DNA and written in the code of A, T, G, and C nucleotides. The base sequence of genes gets transcribed into RNA and then translated into polypeptides. In mRNA, we find triplets of bases called codons, and each codon codes for a specific amino acid or the initiation or termination of translation. In an organism, a gene can mutate. Mutations change the structure of a gene through altering the base sequence. This can be through a substitution, deletion, addition, inversion, or duplication of a segment of DNA or sections of chromosomes. Mutations can be silent, nonsense, or missense. In general, most mutations are either neutral or harmful, and sometimes lethal. If the mutation occurs in the somatic cell, it remains with that individual only, and is eliminated from the body through cell death. If mutation occurs in the germline, they may form new alleles to be passed on to offspring if used in fertilization. It is this germline that we will focus on. These cells undergo the cell reproduction of meiosis. During this process, variation can develop a couple of ways. The first occurs in prophase 1, where DNA condenses into chromosomes and homologs pair up as a bivalent chromosome. Chromatids cross over, forming a synapsis and exchanging homologous segments. This forms new combinations of alleles. Then, the orientation of homologous chromosomes and chromatids to the poles of the cell also can form unique combinations of alleles and gametes. All of this can and does occur in Galapagos tortoises. If two tortoises are fortunate enough to meet and mate, the gametes play a role in sexual reproduction, resulting in the sperm fertilizing an ovum. It is pretty random which sperm will fertilize which ovum. In many species of reptiles, another source of variation exists through temperature-dependent sex determination. In this, temperature determines whether the hatchling will become male or female. Position of the egg in the nest and climate play a role in this. A second ingredient of natural selection is the overproduction of offspring. This could be through the female laying a lot of eggs per clutch, or the total number of births in the population. The library at San Diego Zoo published a fact sheet about Galapagos tortoises in 2010. In it, they state, the average clutch size ranges between 8 to 17 eggs, and are laid most between July and November. After an incubation period of 3 to 8 months, about 80% of the eggs in a clutch will hatch, which is alright because they can lay a clutch every 1 to 2 weeks, up to 4 clutches. Now, imagine the Galapagos archipelago before sailors carried away these animals in masses for a source of meat, or when they were harvested for their oil to light the lamps of Quito, Ecuador, and the population of tortoises on at least 15 islands exceeded 200,000. Today, the population is estimated to be around 20 to 25,000 individuals. Had there been hundreds of thousands of tortoises, think of how many clutches were being laid a year and how many eggs hatched. On top of this, there is still all the variation created from the previous ingredient. Each turtle possesses a unique combination of alleles, resulting in variation of phenotypes, variation in neck length, shell shapes and sizes, and leg length. Some variations can become adaptations, a feature that is common in a population because it provides some improved function. There are now too many individuals in the population than what the environment can support, and some of these variations are going to have to act. Galapagos tortoises can survive without food or water for up to a year, but at some point the population size would just become ridiculous. And the distribution of organisms is affected by both biotic and abiotic factors. More tortoises in a smaller area increases the chance of spreading disease. It also increases the competition for the limited resources on their island. Plants are a renewable resource, but it takes time for them to grow. So, the tortoises with variations well adapted to the environmental conditions will be able to exploit more resources. The more nutrition a tortoise gets, the more extra leftover calories can be devoted to reproduction. Those with adaptations have a better chance of reproducing, and those without may lose their opportunity during the mating season. The communities of organisms in an ecosystem are constantly competing for the same limited resources. Some will be winners and others will become locally extinct, unless they find a different, unoccupied niche in the ecosystem. A key point to this, and something I haven't outright stated yet, is variations and adaptations must be heritable. If the hatchling inherits a combination of alleles that express the positive variant, it will have an increased, but not guaranteed, chance of surviving and reproducing a new generation. The abiotic and biotic factors that shape how a species is distributed really does affect all of this. These are called selection pressures, external agents affecting survival in a given environment. These are positive for well-adapted individuals and negative for those who are not. But which adaptations are beneficial is not constant. Changes in the environment can shift what constitutes as beneficial. Resource availability, environmental conditions, and biological factors may fluctuate. Tortoises occurring on the well-watered islands with short, cropped vegetation had gently curved front edges to their shells. Tortoises occurring on more arid islands had to stretch their necks to reach branches of cactus and other vegetation. Consequently, these latter individuals had longer necks and a high peak to the front edges of their shells, which enabled them to stretch their heads almost vertically. If a tortoise is occurring on an arid island and has a shorter neck and a less curved shell edge, and it's a rainy year producing lower growing vegetation, it has a chance of surviving and reproducing for that year and passing on its genes. And so, variation continues within the population. This is how natural selection acted as a mechanism to form the 11 extant species remaining on the Galapagos Islands. And to make a long story short, that's natural selection. There are other mechanisms other than natural selection that can lead to the evolution of a species. Mutation is one of them, which was previously explained. Migration is another, where individuals move in and out of populations. Genetic drift is yet another, and definitely played a role in these tortoises. Genetic drift is the chance disappearance of particular alleles from a population. In one respect, The original tortoises on the island possessed a limited set of alleles of the ancestral population on mainland South America. The only alleles that were passed on to future generations, or would mutate for that matter, could only occur with these alleles. This is the founder effect. But another way genetic drift occurred is through the hunting of tortoises for meat and oil. The ones who were killed and/or kidnapped was totally random and also meant the loss of alleles from the populations. This is why learning evolution can be challenging. There are many parts within the system, or ecosystem, that are in fluctuating periods of stability and disruption, and so many factors affect and shape the changes in a species or population. Using examples helps provide something concrete through which to understand this fascinating process.